So we'll quickly move on to Unit 7, which is about industry structures and pricing. So in this module, we'll be talking about the ownership structures of businesses. So what are the different ownership structures in business, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of those structures? We'll be talking about alternative theories of firm motivation, what really motivates companies. We'll be talking about factors underlying business growth, vertical and horizontal integration, how conglomerates are formed. We'll be talking about pricing and price bundling, as well as other pricing mechanisms. Then we'll go on to globalization. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it something in between? Who wins and who loses? And then I'll briefly talk about real business examples from Walmart and iCare to see how those principles work in practice. So there are four main ownership structures for a business. You can have what's called a sole proprietorship, which is very easy to set up, but it doesn't protect the owners. And this is usually for small businesses that don't have any employees or have very few employees, and usually just very small family businesses. And the main disadvantage of this is that there's no continuity and they're not protected. The second type of business ownership structure is a partnership. And there are two types of partnerships. There's unlimited liability and there's limited liability. In a partnership, as long as it's a limited liability partnership, the owners are protected, which means that if the company runs into financial difficulties, the liability for those financial debts or debt obligations don't affect their personal assets. They only affect the assets of the company, and it's a much more protective structure. There's also the corporation, where you can actually sell stocks to the public. And in a corporation as well, you're legally protected, and all of the shareholders are only responsible. They also have limited liability, so they're only responsible as to what is in the company, but they're not, again, their personal assets don't get affected. And then there's a cooperative, and this is usually, a group of people um, th- that come together to form a business. It's usually a non-profit making structure, and basically it's more difficult to raise money using this structure. So sometimes a group of workers, for instance, will come together and form a cooperative, and the main aim of the cooperative isn't to make profit, or isn't as profit driven, but and that's why these cooperatives sometimes find it a bit harder to raise money externally when they're structured as a cooperative. Although cooperatives have been known to also be able to raise money externally, it's just that the structure is a bit less wieldy. So, alternative theories of firm motivation. What actually motivates firms? We've always said that firms exist to make profit, but that is actually not always the case. There are two scenarios that have been identified by economists that might also provide alternative motivations for firms. Shareholders, and that might be just for the purpose of shareholder return and not necessarily to make profit, but to return money to shareholders. And number two, there's a stakeholder theory as well, where stakeholders in the firm, such as customers, employees, even environmental concerns, may be important for them as well. And these are all the different stakeholders that a company interacts with or has an effect on. It may also be making sure that their stakeholders are happy, and that doesn't always mean that they're maximizing profit. And a good example of that is in a company called Enron. And a famous sort of theory around alternative theories of motivation played out with Enron, and it's called the principal agent problem. Now, the outside world relies, or the stakeholders, or the shareholders, or the management usually employs somebody to be the face of the company and represent their interests. And that person may not always be the person running the company. So there are two sets of people: there's the agent and the principal. And because the group of people running the organization aren't necessarily the same people that have the stakeholder interests at heart, you come into a situation where there's a conflict of interests, and that conflict basically that is at the heart of the um, principal agent problem. So factors underlying business growth. How can companies grow? They grow through vertical integration, horizontal integration, or they can grow into conglomerates. So in terms of vertical integration, sometimes the best example I can give of vertical integration is one of Nigeria's favorite brands, Oando. Oando was a downstream oil and gas industry player, and they were in the business primarily of fuel stations. And I think it was 2014-15, they acquired ConocoPhillips assets, and they wanted to go upstream and be the producers of the crude as well as retailing it. And the grand plan was at some stage to even be a refiner of crude as well. So they wanted to fully vertically integrate across the oil and gas value chain. So when you're going up to where your product is made, or you're coming down and buying something further downstream, that's called vertical integration. Horizontal integration is when you're buying up adjacent businesses, but at the same sort of level of production as you. So, say Access Bank acquiring Intercontinental is an example of horizontal integration. And then you have conglomerates that own something in almost every industry. So a Dangote group, for instance, where it's, tomatoes and rice and pasta and petrol and plastic and crude. That's an example of a conglomerate structure where there's a lot of seemingly unrelated businesses all under the same umbrella. But is bigger better? We've spoken about, how companies expand, how they can vertically integrate and how they can horizontally integrate and how they can form these conglomerate structures and just get bigger and bigger and bigger. But is bigger necessarily better? Well, first of all, there's some industries for which scale really doesn't add very much value. So making them bigger and bigger and bigger doesn't really give you any advantage against a smaller company. And sometimes, even in scalable businesses, this economies of scale can set in where you're so big that it actually makes production unproductive, or productive less efficient, production less efficient. Brands also matter as well, and some people, some customers are really choosy about their brands, and they don't like big brands. They don't like things that are the standardization that comes with those big brands. They want unique items. They want things that are quirky. So it doesn't always appeal to all of the customers in a particular customer base. There's also a maximum efficient scale, and that varies between industries, but there's a point that you get to in any industry where that's a maximum efficient scale. That's most scale that you can have in that particular industry, and getting bigger than the maximum efficient scale is not necessarily always a good idea. The dual sector theory I'll quickly talk about, and that's a theory of two sectors. It describes the markets as divided into the primary and secondary sectors. The primary sector is composed of primarily large firms that have enough scale, they've been sheltered from competition, and they enjoy revenue surpluses. Whereas the primary sector consists of small firms that are unable to generate revenue structures. So economists call this the dual sector theory, where there's two sectors in every market, one with big successful companies and one with smaller unsuccessful companies, and it's difficult to move between the two. We're going to finish off by talking about pricing behavior on this slide and globalization on the next slide, and the advantages and disadvantages of globalization. But first, I'll be talking about pricing behavior. There's three main types of pricing behavior that I'll talk about. Price bundling, which is the sale of two or more products together as a package, and it can either be beneficial for the customer in some cases, but in some cases it can leave the customer worse off. Then there's drip pricing or add-on pricing, where the customer isn't told the full cost of the transaction until the transaction is always almost complete. Very annoying, but that's also one type of pricing behavior. And then there's transfer pricing. We spoke about conglomerates and multinationals on the last slide, and a transfer price is the price at which subsidiaries of a multinational use when they're doing business with each other. Now on to globalization. Globalization, when it started happening, it added a whole new dimension to business. As companies like Walmart, for instance, who I'll be talking about a bit later, search the globe for cheaper products. iCare is also a firm that I'll be talking about in later slides, and they also do global business, but with a slightly different approach from Walmart. So the advantages, this is quite a busy slide, but it's really important for us to go through everything and understand the advantages of globalization. So globalization brings, a number of potential benefits to international producers, to national economies, including an incentive for countries to specialize and benefit from comparative advantage, access to larger markets that may have higher demand for certain products. Globalization also enables us to access world sources of cheap raw materials, and it helps us to be cost competitive in that way. Avoiding regulation. Sometimes people take advantage of globalization to locate production in countries with less stringent regulatory regimes, like developing countries. Globalization has also led to flows of inward investments between countries, which has created benefits for recipient countries. This includes sharing of knowledge and technology between different countries that wouldn't have happened if not for globalization. And in the long term, increased trade is likely to lead to the creation of more employment in all the countries that are involved. The disadvantages. There's a longer list of disadvantages. I am actually very pro globalization, but there's just a longer list of disadvantages that I found online than the advantages. So a key disadvantage is the over standardization of products through global branding, and this is a common criticism of globalization. For example, I'm using Microsoft right now, Windows operating system, and clearly the standardizing of a computer operating system and platform creates a lot of benefits. But critics argue that this also creates a lack of product diversity and presents multiple barriers to entry to small local producers who could have produced software that was just as good, maybe better, but we'll never know because of the huge network effect that globalization has played, and the network effect that Microsoft has in the operating system industry. Large multinationals can also suffer from diseconomies of scale, such as, difficulties associated with coordinating all their different resource activities over different time zones, different cultures based in different countries. So globalization can lead to diseconomies of scale as well. The increased sort of power and influence of large multinationals is often seen as a disadvantage of globalization. For example, large multinationals can switch their investments between territories in favor of the most favorable regulatory regimes. And they can act as local monopolies of labor and push wages lower than the free market equilibrium because they're so big. Critics of globalization also highlight the potential loss of jobs in domestic markets caused by unequal fair trade sometimes. So when we close down factories in America, close down factories in Europe, move them to China, move them to Asia, of course that causes a lot of a loss of jobs. There's also the issue of deindustrialization, which erodes an economy's manufacturing base. One of the most significant criticisms of globalization is the associated risk with the interdependence of economies. And we've seen that hugely with COVID-19, where we've had difficulty sourcing medical equipment, we've had difficulty sourcing PPE, we've had difficulty sourcing drugs. And that's because, it makes countries very interdependent on each other. Another disadvantage is over specialization, and it makes countries, over reliant on producing a very limited range of goods for a global market. A sudden downturn, like you've seen in the countries, for instance, that rely heavily on tourism, plunged the economy into recession. And I think they gave tourism as an example here. Globalization also generates winners and losers. And it's for this reason that you're more likely to increase inequality, as rich nations benefit more than poorer ones. And I guess we've seen that not so much in Asia, but particularly in Africa. Also, globalization from an environmental perspective has not necessarily been good. There's been increased pollution, and it's also contributed to CO2 emissions and global warming. And it has accelerated the depletion of non-renewable resources such as oil. So globalization has changed a lot of lives, but I think it's important to remember that there are advantages and disadvantages.